As we look at this plant phylogenetic tree, we can see that the land plants are broken into two large categories called the vascular plants and the non-vascular plants. So we've talked about the non-vascular plants, which we call bryophytes in general. And now we're going to start to talk about the most primitive vascular plants that we know of. And specifically, these are going to be the seedless ones. So the seedless vascular plants will include two different phylum. We're going to have Lycophyta and Pteridophyta. And now we're going to talk about those two. So when we talk about ferns and other seedless vascular plants, it is two different phylum that we're talking about. So we have Lycophyta, which we call the club mosses. And then we also have what we call Pteridophyta. And this will be what we typically know of as ferns. Now, some of the big differences that you're going to see here when we start to talk about these vascular plants, and specifically seedless vascular plants, is we're going to start seeing the sporophyte enlarged. So the sporophyte is going to be enlarged. It will start to become dominant. So we're going to see this progression where in the bryophytes we had a dominant gametophyte generation. We're going to see that switch over to be a dominant sporophyte generation. And then we're also going to have the evolution of the vascular tissue, and we'll see some other characteristics that are a little bit different as well. So if we talk first about the vascular tissue, when we're talking about vascular tissue, we're talking about specific tissue for transport. And we're going to have two different types of vascular tissue. The first one is xylem. And hopefully you've heard of xylem or that word at some point before, but xylem is important for water transport. So this will enable the plant to take in water at one location, typically the roots, and then transport that water from down in the soil up into the leaves. This is going to be shaped like straws, essentially. So you have long, slender cells that are going to line up end to end to help move that water around the plant. The most primitive type is what we call tracheids. And so that's what we're really going to have when we're talking about these seedless vascular plants. So these are just really long, slender cells, and they will line up with other long, slender cells so that the water that's absorbed can just flow right up like a straw up into the aerial parts of the tissue. Now, another very important thing that developed along with the xylem vascular tissue is we started to get lignification of cell walls. And when we're talking about lignification, lignin, this is going to be a polymer. And this polymer provides a lot of structural support. So this enabled plants to get a lot taller. So we've got the ability to transport water around, and we've also got these strong cells that will help to then hold that large plant upright. If we point out where the xylem is in this picture, these cells in the center, those would be the xylem cells. So those are going to be tracheid cells. And that red ring that you see around them is going to be the lignified cell wall. So that's going to enable them, again, to be very strong and to support a larger plant size. Another type of vascular tissue is what we call phloem. And phloem is responsible for the food transport. So while the xylem is for water transport, if you think about where the water is typically located at, it would be in the roots. So usually the xylem is going to be transporting things up. And the phloem, on the other hand, is transporting food, and the food tends to be made in the leaves. So the phloem is typically going to transport food down into the lower parts of the plant and into the roots. If we point out the phloem in this picture, this area here, those would be phloem cells. So with the evolution of the vascular tissue and the lignification, this did definitely help plants to increase their size. And by being taller, this was a big advantage for plants because this is going to enable them to just capture more light. And it's also going to raise them up so that they can get better spore dispersal. So the higher they are, the further those spores can actually carry. If we talk about the roots did evolve at this point in time as well. So if we have a little plant here, so if we just draw us a little plant, the roots are going to be located at the base. And these roots, they have two main purposes to them. So what these roots are going to do, so that's our soil line, is they are for attachment, which is something that the rhizoids provided for the bryophytes. But the other big thing that they do is that they are going to collect or absorb water. And another thing that they're absorbing is nutrients. So now we have specialized structures that are below ground that are going to capture the food that some of the food that the plant needs, and then we've got the vascular tissue that is going to be able to transport that up into the higher regions of the plant. If we talk about leaves was another very important development at this point. We do have leaves increasing the surface area. So if we're increasing the surface area, this is going to maximize sunlight collection. And this is good because this is going to then help us to have more photosynthesis, so it's going to increase photosynthetic efficiency. The leaves are going to be the primary photosynthetic organ. So these are going to be up on the aerial parts of the plants, so definitely above the soil line, so that they can capture that light energy and then convert that into organic molecules that are usable by the rest of the plant. If we talk about the evolution of the leaves and their complexity, this is where we start to see a big difference between the Lycophyta phylum and the Pteridophyta. So we can divide these new leaves into two categories. We have microphyls and megaphylls, depending on how evolved they actually are. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we see the microphyls. And the microphyls are the ones that you're going to see in the Lycophyta. These are very, very small, simple leaves. They're only really slightly expanded. And you usually only have a single strand of vascular tissue. And that's one of the reasons that these are going to be so small, because they're not going to have vascular tissue really strung all the way throughout them. So in this picture here, if we just expand it a little bit more, you've got this single piece of vascular tissue and then this very small leaf or microphyll that's going to be expanded off of that. If we look at the megaphylls is what we would find in the ferns or the Pteridophyta. And these are more developed. So this is what we're going to have when we're talking about the plants that are more common to us today. These have an expanded surface area. So we're going to have something more like this. And you're not just going to have that one single strand of vascular tissue that runs up it, but instead it's going to be branched off of that. So you've probably seen this kind of thing in leaves where you have this web of vascular tissue, or what you might call veins, extending throughout it. So because there's so much vascular tissue there, these leaves are able to be a little bit larger. And larger is going to be better in this case because it is going to increase the surface area even more to get better light absorption and then better surface area for photosynthesis. Sporophylls was another big advancement. Sporophylls are modified leaves. For sporangia to develop. And if you remember, sporangia are for producing spores. So we've got some variations here. We have what are cone-like structures. And these cones are what we tend to refer to as strobili. And we see that quite a lot in the Lycophyta. We start to see the beginnings of the strobili. And then we can also have just what we see in a lot of ferns down here, where we have these sporophylls, these leaves where you might have these spores produced on the underside of them. And these little groupings of the spores are what we call the sori. And sori would be plural. Sorus would be a singular one. That's where our spores are going to be produced. So if you recall, we're going to have diploid tissue in the sporangia that's going to undergo meiosis. And meiosis is then going to enable them to produce the spores, which would then be haploid or 1N. When we have the spore production, we do have two different types of plants. We can have homosporous spore production, where there's only one type of spore that's produced. So we get one type of spore, and then those spores, they can germinate and produce a gametophyte that will have archegonium and antheridium on it. So it would have the male and the female gametophytes. Or we can have heterosporous spore production, where we actually have the spores germinate as a male gametophyte and a female gametophyte. So the homosporous is considered to be the more primitive type. Heterosporous would be a little more advanced. When we get into the next chapter, where we're looking at the more advanced land plants, we'll see more of the heterosporous condition. The bryophytes were all homosporous. So we start to see the transition here in these seedless vascular plants, where we see more and more of the heterosporous condition. So let's take a look at a typical life cycle for a fern. If we look at this, when you first look at a fern, the plant tissue that you notice or that you see is going to be the sporophyte. So all of those leaves are sporophyte tissue. So here we see that dominant sporophyte, which contrasts with the non-vascular plants where you had the gametophyte that was dominant. On the sporophyte, we will have the sporangium, a lot of times on the lower side of the leaves, and within the sporangium is where you have the meiosis take place. So when meiosis takes place, we will get spores produced, and then those spores, typically they are dispersed by wind. So this sporangium may open up, and then wind is going to disperse those spores. And if they happen to land in a good environment, then they can germinate. And by germinate, they're going to then produce the gametophyte. So you get the egg and the sperm being produced in pretty close proximity to each other, because they could both be on that very same gametophyte. And then we're going to hopefully get some fertilization take place. So if we get production of the zygote, notice that that zygote is going to be dependent on the gametophyte tissue. So it depends on the gametophyte. And this would be for protection purposes and then also for nutrition. So until that zygote gets large enough so that it can produce its own food. So the zygote will grow into the sporophyte that we know of, which is familiar to us, the leaves of the fern. And then once it gets mature, then we would have those sporangia develop on the undersides of the leaves again, so that we have the full life cycle here. If we look specifically at the Lycophyta phylum, this is most known for the club mosses. And if we look at the lycophytes that we have on this slide, notice that most of them are going to have what we call microphylls. They have very small, slender leaves, and they are also going to produce a lot of strobili, many of them. So those strobili will be the structures that produce the sporangia for the spores. So they are the beginnings of cones. In the next chapter, we'll see more developed strobili, developed cones for the production of the spores. These are still going to be pretty low growing plants. A lot of them are epiphytes, which means that they grow on other plants. They're not going to be parasitic, but they do attach to other plants a lot of the times and grow like that. Another thing about them is their roots are not going to be very branched at all. The roots branch only at the tips. So that's Lycophyta. If we talk about the pterophyta or pteridophyta, sometimes it's called, these are our ferns. Ferns are usually pretty familiar to most people, and with the ferns have macrophylls. So we start to see those expanded leaves that have the vascular tissue running throughout them. And we also have what we call the horsetails that make up this group, and we have what we call whisk ferns. So all of these together would fall into the pterophyta group, and these are considered seedless but vascular plants. If we talk about the significance of the seedless vascular plants, these are responsible for lots of photosynthesis early in land plant evolution. And when we're talking about land plant evolution and this increase in photosynthesis, if you'll recall, uses carbon dioxide. So this is actually going to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So these seedless vascular plants, when they started to have this big increase in photosynthesis, these were responsible for what we call global cooling. Okay, so the opposite of what you hear spoke of a lot today with global warming. These did just the opposite. We had global cooling because there was so much photosynthesis going on, and we had the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This did result in some glacier formation. These also formed the first forests that we had. And these are an important source of coal. So even the coal that we use today in the coal mines, a lot of it is from these seedless vascular plants. So they first produced peat, and then that peat over time turned into coal.